Welcome to the Reprobate Pastors Podcast. This continues to be our working title till we come up with a better one. Our podcast is a conversation between three pastors of different Christian faith traditions. I'm Todd Leonard, and I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. Shane Kinnison is a pastor with the American Baptist denomination, and Galen Gobin is a pastor with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And we take the time to talk about what's happening in our world, talk about faith issues that we think are relevant to today. And today we're continuing a conversation about trying to understand the political and religious divide that we see in our country right now. And today we're looking at how conservatives view morality versus how liberals view morality, and asking how we can find ways to bridge to common ground on each other's morality, how to communicate with each other, and how the gospel can inform those conversations. So I hope you enjoy our conversation today, and we look forward to any feedback you want to give us. So I was watching this TED Talk earlier from this moral foundations theorist, Jonathan Haidt. And he talks about 5, and I think since he did this talk, he's revised it to 6. But as far as for our conversation today, 5 foundations for people's morality. And he talks about no harm, doing no harm, care, reciprocal care for one another. He talks about reciprocity and fairness, talks about loyalty to a group or loyalty to individuals, respect for authority, a purity, a self-discipline, having a self-control that guides our individual lives, and then a sense of purity and sanctity, understanding of ourselves and an idealism that we want to pursue. And so when he charted those out on a graph, asking people who identified as liberals in the political sense versus conservatives in the political sense, it showed that for liberals, the areas of avoiding harm and operating with fairness are the two moral foundations for liberals, and the importance of those two are so much higher than respect for authority, loyalty to a group, and purity in the way we live our lives. But as you move towards a more conservative ideology, you see that fairness and harm or not doing harm, those become a little less important for conservatives. But the other 3, authority, loyalty, and purity, rise up to be almost the same. And so for a conservative, all 5 of those moral foundations have about an equal importance. Whereas for a liberal, only fairness and not doing harm have a high priority. And so I found that kind of interesting, because that helps give me a little bit of window into, I think, at least some of the roots of where I see myself as a more liberal person, both politically and religiously, and then my colleagues and friends who identify in the more conservative camp. That seems to ring true for me. And I'm just wondering, for you guys, as we look at that schema, that graph that Haidt put out, does that seem to inform anything? Does it seem to resonate with where you see yourself and see others in this on the spectrum?
Well, first of all, Todd, thank you for inviting us to talk about the 2 issues we've always been told never to discuss among friends: politics and religion. So thank you for setting us up for success today.
It's been nice knowing you guys.
See ya. You reprobate.
Interesting that you bring this forward. I've not seen or heard this before. So it's kind of catching me a little bit off guard, and I need to sit with it a little bit. So I'd be interested to sort of unpack it with you,
Hmm.
if you guys want to unpack it some today. My first initial thought is this: just the way you've described or defined or described the graph. My first initial thought is this: that conservatives have the corner of the market on moral foundations if they lean to all five, and the more liberal populace has less of a moral foundation. I don't believe that's true. I'm just saying I think that I find it interesting that maybe some would view it that way. That we have, and again, it perpetuates that split or that gap between the two groups, right? That we have more and you have less. Now we have more moral authority, you have less moral authority. So anyway, other than that, I don't know where to go with this except just to listen and jump in from time to time.
Yeah, I I heard him talking on a podcast with Krista Tippett. Actually, it was several years ago. It's been a long time since I've heard that, but that was the first time that I heard this, and heard of him and all. And he even talks about, if I remember correctly, the way the brain, within liberals and conservatives is set up, and that you're almost in some ways kind of wired to be one or the other in part. It's that old nature nurture sort of question. But I really like what he has to say, and I would push back a little bit on that, since as you categorize it there, or label it, Sean, when you, yeah, Shane, I understand what you're saying with, well, conservatives, well, we've got all five and you only have two, so you guys are only 40% of the way there. And all, but I'm like you, Todd. I would label myself very definitely, liberal / progressive, or whatever, how much ever help labels can be, both theologically and politically. But I think that, again, at least from my perspective, and all, it his categorizations help to understand the lack of communication between, the conversations going like this, because if you're holding that sense of not hurting people or not doing harm or whatever, then of course you're going to lift up equality, because you want everybody to have, and that sense of fairness. I think both of those are playing in. But in realities, when you start to do that, it certainly changes the structure of the, not only the way we look at things, but the institutions, which then is going to impact my sense of loyalty if I'm on the other side of that, and the sense of comfortableness that I send, and again, that sense of purity that's there as well. But I guess I guess I just push back a little bit with this sense of that, they're stronger or better. I can see them making the case, but I just really it but it gets my cockles up and things and all.
And I think the what people will say is, if you're a progressive person, you would say, well, all five of those aren't equal in importance. Fairness and not harming, or making sure there's justice for all, should be higher than authority, loyalty, and purity. That we have to make those a priority. Whereas a conservative person would say, you can't leave any behind, and you everyone. And that's so, like both of you are saying, for a conservative, they probably say, yeah, we all of these things matter. We care about all morality. Whereas a liberal would say, no, what all morality boils down to is do unto others as you would have done unto you, and everything else falls beneath that. And so there is that difference of what matters. But I think you see this because, when you really boil it down to, you would say that a liberal would, they would value fairness and justice, uh, and they're willing to fight for that at the expense of keeping societal order. That they're willing to give up
Right.
some order and status quo in order to get closer to justice and fairness for all. Whereas a conservative would say, order is so important. It doesn't just happen. We have to really work hard to keep things orderly and calm. And therefore, we will work to maintain order, even if some people are hurt in the process. They say, we want to make sure that everyone has a chance not to be hurt. That would be the argument. But probably some people will be hurt. But order and a system that works for most people is so important that we're willing that some people may not experience the same benefits as others, and where that kind of boils down to those two things.
Yeah.
And where,
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm jumping on you.
No, and I think where Haidt later adds in a sixth value, the sixth value that he added in later was liberty, and this idea of honoring liberty and independence, and the value of the individual also is a morality point that is much more valued in conservatives than in liberals. So that's why I was just going to finish with that. Go ahead, Galen.
Yeah. Well, I wish we had somebody who really would hold to those, that conservative viewpoint here, because it's a bit of a straw man here. I think with the thought that came to my mind, and that is that were that true, that authority and order and systems and things need to be maintained so that society, and we want to make sure that it's all fair and just. But if that were true, then we'd still be having slaves, and we would still, women wouldn't have the right to vote, at least in this country. Native Americans would not be considered persons with that. And as we have grown in knowledge, which science has helped us to discover, we have learned that there is not a dome that holds back the waters above the earth that keeps it from drowning, and that the sun is the center of the solar system, and that we're way out on the edge of the universe. We would be lost, I think, in being able to make much progress, because any kind of progress means that somebody's life has to change. And if we're going to maintain that purity, if we're going to maintain the structures, if we're going to maintain the authority, until the authority says something, it doesn't change. It doesn't grow, and stress within the system is what helps to make things move forward and grow. And without that, if somebody's just keeping the cap on it and keeping knowledge or whatever from being out there, because, oh my God, this could hurt people or change things or whatever, then I not sure how far back you want to go back to figure out where it is we would have stopped.
But I think when you look for me, looking at what happened with the election this year, and with and then what the insurrection at the Capitol, though that is the most extreme expression of those who were voting for Donald Trump and who still value that more, and we would say it's not necessarily a classically conservative. Trump is not a classic conservative, but he was, one of his key themes was law and order,
Mm-hmm.
and he wanted to build a wall on the southern border, because and those things resonate with. We can't I think why it resonated with a significant swath of the population um, who are wired more conservatively, whether by nature or nurture or both, um, is the progressiveness and the progressive agenda and everything that's changed in our world and is happening so quickly with the advancement in technology, um, and then the social change that is happening. I think for a lot of people, it's like we need somebody to stop this down. It is where we are headed is so scary. And then, of course, there are people on the right who are inflaming those fears. But the idea of everything that I've known, everything that I was able to count on, or that my parents were able to count on in society, all those things are falling away. And uh, the liberal politicians are continuing to push for this radical change. And so when you throw out words like socialism uh, and radical gender equality, or in things like and sexual equity, orientation equity, racial equity, all those things um, sounds have been framed as threats to the status quo that we're going to descend into chaos. And I think that for a lot of progressives, we don't see chaos, we don't see it becoming chaos, but maybe what we would define as chaos is much more extreme, but we're comfortable with a certain level of disorder because that means the change is happening and we're growing. Whereas for a more conservative mind, that any bit of change is very fearful and uncomfortable and threatens my equilibrium and my sense of peace and well-being.
In crisis management leadership, the fundamental action that you take is the twofold principle of stop the bleeding and do no harm. So I find it interesting that the author that you're quoting uses that idea of doing no harm as one of the 5 or 6 moral foundations in society. I wonder, as I'm kind of just listening to what the two of you are saying and trying to get a grasp of what the author was saying, though I haven't read or listened to him yet, the idea of the do no harm, is that basically worked out in 911 scenarios, in high stress scenarios? Is that worked out in chaotic situations? And if there is a sense of normalcy, if there is a sense of evenness or even-temperedness in society, then how do we work out this idea of doing no harm? So maybe the moral foundation of doing no harm is meant to be there to move us through these chaotic periods and these chaotic and volcanic experiences as a culture or as a larger community. Just some of my thought, I'm just equating the idea of doing no harm as a moral foundation with doing no harm as crisis management.
And that's a good question. I don't know that I necessarily have the answer exactly of what a more obviously what a moral foundation theorist would say. But I think that for a conservative, keeping law and order, keeping the peace, is part of that doing no harm. If everybody understands their place and how they function in that place, and structures and institutions are operating as they are supposed to, then everybody is treated as they deserve for the most part, and everybody has that the level of freedom that law and order allows to find their happiness, to pursue happiness as much as possible, as long as we all function within those norms. But having the system in place for law enforcement to write tickets and to arrest, and for the judicial system to weigh whether or not somebody is guilty of a crime, and punishing them if they are found guilty, in order to let people know that there is a price for harming other people, helps keep things in order. And And I think what we saw in the Capitol, again, the people who actually stormed the Capitol, we are recognizing are on the very fringe, but they would say that insurrection, that breach of the norms was necessary because they saw society already crumbling. And so there needed to be an insurrection to put Donald Trump back in the presidency, because he was the one who's going to bring things back in line to the way they're supposed to operate. And so that act of violence was a necessary evil to bring back the status quo as they understood it before. And so I think from that sense of doing no harm, the system that keeps everybody in their place does no harm for the conservative. Whereas I think for the liberals, we would say those systems have always harmed certain people. It's the same people who are always harmed by the system. If there was equal suffering across the board, okay. But there hasn't been. It's been women. It's been people of color. It's been LGBTQ folks. It's been immigrants. There's always been the people who get stomped on by the system to a certain degree.
So would it be possible then for us to journey back into the historic Christian narrative for just a moment and consider the life of Jesus in reference to these moral foundations? I find it interesting as I'm listening to you talk that Jesus was very committed to the law. He said he didn't come to demolish it, he came to fulfill it. He was very committed to the law. He was very pious in his religious expression, very committed to his religious traditions, but broke ranks at every turn with those who were in positions and power of leadership, or positions of leadership and authority and power. He broke ranks with them at every turn. And those who had that puritanical, a word we used last week, those who had that puritanical mentality of purity, right? And of authority, and following the letter of the law, and keeping the masses under control, and keeping everybody in their place. That's what discipleship meant. That's what the in-group meant, right? Is to make sure everyone was in their proper place and no one was out of line. Jesus broke with that at every single turn. And that's why he became literally the enemy of the state. And you see then the outworking of the do no harm and the desire for justice and equity. You see that outworking in the demonstrations of his life. And so I'm just taking it to that. Let's go there for a moment and talk about how these moral foundations were exhibited in his journey.
Yeah, I mean, he's, biblically in his life, in his world, as you say, he became the enemy of the state. He um, went into Simon's house, and had dinner with Zacchaeus, and who was somebody in his own community who was not going to be touched, and was touched by lepers and by women, and don't you know who she is, and all of those kinds of things, which, when I read those things coming from the not only the do no harm, but the fairness and the equality of things, those are people, that they are people too, who were not, if we stayed with the sense of organization and structure and purity and puritanical things, that and again, straw man biblically, but that the Pharisees are set up to be in the writings. It's that gives you the picture of the harm that gets done when that side of those three, if you will, of Haidt's moral foundations are actually uplifted higher than the sense of fairness and do no harm, because those people continue to be harmed. That's what we were saying earlier, that how you define and determine those, all of these things really come from your perspective. And the thing that we are so poor about doing, and I raised my hand on that, everything, is working with and listening to people from other perspectives, because what that requires is a sense of humility, which is something that Jesus had, I believe. And I think humility is something that comes to us, or that is the gift of the the cycle of life and death. Because as you come back out, however you want to back out with those, with those sense of losses, as you come back around through those and come back onto your feet again through, whatever loss it may be, other than the one that, sends you out from this world. Humility becomes the opportunity, becomes the gift of the opportunity. And far too many of us don't have a lot of that, because humility is like what Paul says, counting others who as better than yourself, which always gets worked around and dealt with and all, but at least is counted as them having a voice. And many of those people have never had a voice, and wouldn't have a voice if authority and Donald Trump and the Pharisee and the mega church pastor who, evangelical, who stands within that dogmatic range, has their say about it.
Well, I would say too, in this moral foundation, or these foundations, if these are actually moral, if they're ethical and moral, then they must be exhibited in Jesus's life to some degree. And so you take the other three, being authority and group and purity. I don't think that Jesus then would have rejected those out of hand.
Mm-mm.
Instead, I think he would have redefined them and re-identified them, perhaps, or reactualized them. When you think about authority, what was a moral foundation of authority for Jesus? It was the authority of servanthood. Whoever wants to be the greatest will become the least. That's Jesus's take on authority. This in group, this collective, this sense of community. What did Jesus say about community? Everyone around you will know you are my followers if you love one another. So there's that idea of community. So authority being redefined in service, humble service. In group being redefined in agape love toward one another. And then this idea of purity. Jesus didn't go puritanical in his approach. He went with the idea of purity being atonement, being reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
Redefining purity as reconciliation. Reconciliation is maybe the supremacy of purity. To be reconciled with God who created you, reconciled with your fellow man, and reconciled with yourself.
And I would just say, I'll jump on and add the purity of love. Is that your love really moves to a place of your, where Jesus says, you say love those who love you, but I say love your enemies. Yeah, that he says, take your love
Mm-hmm.
needs to go to another level. It talks about your relationship with your spouse. Well, you have these reasons for how you can get divorced. He says, no, you take that love deeper. See what you can do to to give of yourself to someone to really, truly love them, and don't always take the easy way out of things or justify why you hate somebody else or harm somebody else, that you really dive into that love, make that love pure, that it doesn't get corrupted by other competing agendas. Yeah, I think there's a lot. I really liked what you said about Jesus redefining that morality, because if we accept Jesus as a man, whatever we understand about his divinity, Jesus would have been born with that same nature nurture experience of coming into the world and growing up. He would have carried those same values. So, but you're right, he transcends and redefines what those look like. But I think you can see it, but then you can see Christianity, and you can see the strains of Christianity valuing these different moralities. And you can see, in, for my Seventh-day Adventist tradition, which is very much an evangelical tradition, the purity of belief, not purity of love, but purity of belief and purity of Christian behavior, and respect for the authorities, respect for God, respect for leadership, and loyalty to our specific group. There is such a high level of inner loyalty among Seventh-day Adventists, and even though that is less strong than it was 30 or 40 years ago, there's that still a high sense of loyalty for a conservative evangelical Christianity. And to the degree that you see churches still thriving, the larger churches in our country are those who have those high values of morality around purity and loyalty and authority. And the more liberal mainline denominations, like Disciples for Galen and the American Baptist, I would assume to some degree, Shane, and then certainly Episcopalians, Congregationalists, because their morals are the fairness and justice, doing no harm, making sure everybody's cared for, and purity, loyalty, authority is low. They're dying quickly because they don't have that group loyalty and loyalty to an authority structure. And so I've heard conservatives point to that and say, see, their faith is lacking, is poor because they're not staying in church. And the liberals would say, well, we're fulfilling the purpose of what church was there for, and maybe we just don't understand what church needs to look like now. That I don't know, and I may be actually missing the point on that part. But that's one of the criticisms, again, that a religious right has about the religious left.
Well, I would think then, Todd, based on what you're saying, the danger that all of us are experience is walking that thin precipice of valuing these moral foundations in a prioritization way, that some moral foundations are more important and some are less important. So we have to be very careful about that, because you've just said there are some groups that magnetize around these various foundations, and they narrowly define them. And in their narrow definition and their narrow outworking of that moral foundation, that's where they find their strength, their unity, or their sense of oneness or togetherness or whatever. So we have to be very careful. If these are all moral, then not one is more important or less important than the other. They have to be defined and worked out by the covenant communities, or by the society, by the neighborhood, by the family group, or whomever.
But that is worked out. That is worked out for many of these by the professional person who is paid to be there to read the text, to write the things, and all of that. And so what you end up with then oftentimes is a great big ego, because everybody's looking at me for the answers, or me and my group for the answers. I just, and it sounds awful, but but outside of an authority outside of myself, I don't think that I don't have a lot of hope for humanity in the sense, as horrible as that sounds, because ultimately we will all choose for our own selves. Our ego will choose to be protected, and we will find ways to define what we need to protect ourselves. It's about a personal sense of surviving. Yeah, I think it still comes back to that sense, kind of like we were talking about last week, of some sort of existential kind of threat or experience with that. And I think the people that have stormed the Capitol are, their ego is based in, and their security, their protection and stuff is based in the hierarchy that has been set up, the authority that has been set up, that now really is being protected by Donald Trump, who says, I'm the only one that can fix this. I'm the only one that can do this. And I become willing to give myself in and unto him so that my own personal sense is protected and I can continue to function. There just is this there's a lack of humility then to entertain the questions and the voices. You were saying, Jesus had a different authority, and that's what scripture points to. And scripture does not give us the exact, Jesus never absolutely answers people's questions. you know what do we whose coin is it? Well, it's got Caesar's head on it. Then okay, give everything to Caesar's and to God. He does. But we humans want to lay that out, and we want the specifics for that, because now it's a lot more easy for me. It doesn't call for me to be open, to be fair, to be just, to believe and feel that somebody else has some moral authority by their experience, um, and have to live in uncertainty. That's what you were saying, a little bit. You touched on that earlier, Todd, about having that sense of uncertainty. You used the word chaos, but I'm not sure I'm comfortable in chaos, but I am a little more comfortable in uncertainty and walking the path and the journey.
Well,
And
isn't this the benefit of having a bullet pointed statement of faith?
sure,
Isn't this the benefit of having a bullet pointed doctrinal stance or doctrinal position? That this is who we are, this is what we believe, this is what we value, and this is how we live it out. And none of this is open for discussion.
right.
None of it.
Because we can count who's in, who's out, and I'm safe, and are you going to hell or not?
And so you can apply that. You can take that bullet-pointed statement of faith or doctrinal position statement, and you can apply that in faith. You can apply it in politics. You can apply it in social settings, and
Yep.
you can. It's universally applicable.
Yeah.
This is who we are. This is what we believe. This is what we value, and this is how we live it out. And it is not open for dialogue.
Right. Jesus says to us, it's not what goes in that's bad, it's what comes out. It's what flows out, and from where? And from your heart is what Jesus says. Flows out from your heart. All of those things that you just mentioned, Shane, all flow out of what we believe and hold true, and what we demand to be true. Because when I demand of it to be true, then I can line myself up and feel comfortable and feel safe. If you're going to leave things, morally relative, and that's such a big word right now with, in theological conversations and stuff, this whole sense of relativity, the postmodernism and all, then, well, you can't complain about anything. You can't say that's bad and that's good, or whatever. You have to be open then to being able to sit at the table and learn from somebody else's experience and learn what has worked for them. And as we go forward together, what is going to work for us as we create community together. And we have to struggle with our language. We have to struggle with our presence. We have to struggle with what we're comfortable with doing with, I'm walk up and, hey, hi, this is me, and let me hug you and stuff like that. And, I'm not there because I'm a victim of trauma or something like that, or victim's a bad word. And it's just, you're not thinking and stuff, but I'm a survivor of trauma. I'm a survivor of something. We have to pause and slow down a little bit and everything and get to know one another. And we're not comfortable doing that because when I know you, it's going to change me. Cicely Tyson died this last weekend and was listening to one of the many places that had a conversation with her. And she said that it was back when she made Sounder, which was in the late 60s, early 70s, I guess. I can't remember. I remember seeing it, remember watching it. And she said she was at a gathering with people, and she said this white man stood up and he said, I have to thank you for, and I'm paraphrasing and stuff, but this is the gist. I have to thank you for doing this and making this movie. He said, I never realized that Black people would call when the kids called the father daddy in there, that's what I called my dad. And he said, or Tyson reported that she gave him a lot of credit for standing up and admitting and learning that there was some humanity here. And that was somewhere, I think, in the South or whatever. Not sure again where I heard the quote from and when comment, but to be able to hear and see somebody else as a human being and to allow that person to be in conversation with me, which that person was when he heard that language. She and the kids became human to him finally. And that's a place of vulnerability. And he's got to shift now. And most of us don't want to do that. We're very uncomfortable with that.
It's an idolatry to certainty that we all have, and I think there is, which goes back to us really wanting to be right. I mean, and not right on the political spectrum, but correct in our politics, correct in our theology, correct in anything that we do, and moving back into that place of humility is such a ongoing effort, I think, for all of us to continue to say, I can learn from somebody else. I can listen to their story. And that's why stories, I think, continue to be so powerful. Is it's hard to argue with a story. You can't argue with somebody calling somebody who doesn't look like you or live in the place that you do, still operating with the similar moral basis that you are, and the similar moral experiences that you have, and no matter how we put them in order of priority and which ones are more important or which are less, we all value all five of those to some degree, and you will find those moral issues played out in everybody's lives, and if you're paying attention, you'll see them, and then you find that place of commonality, and then you start wanting the best for those folks as much as you do for or you, at least a little bit more, have a little bit more interest in their their success, their well-being, as much as people in your own group, however that's defined. But as long as we're going to have the argument about who's right and who's wrong, I think we will struggle. We won't hear each other. And I don't know, and like you, Galen, I don't know how optimistic I am about people hearing each other, but I have hopes that some people will hear each other. I have hopes that some people are still somewhat open to considering other viewpoints, and not running with their eyes closed and their ears closed and their mouth wide open.
I remember, even at my age, I remember the day in my culture. I can't speak for other cultures, but I remember the day in my culture where there was always religion, there was always politics, and religion and politics were always in the same house of worship. I remember the day when there were Democrats and Republicans in the same house of worship, serving together, worshiping together, praying together, being on ministry and mission together. And there was, was it tense? There were times. Was there a tension? There was always kind of that tension, when you're pulling in directions, there's always a tension. But was it amicable and was it doable? Yes, it always was. And I'm also old enough to remember that after that, I began to witness for myself in my culture. I began to witness for myself the nationalization of religion. And when religion started on the journey of nationalization, then the fabric of the local gatherings of churches and believers and communities of faith, those began to split. They began to tear away. They began to segmentize and compartmentalize. So that as of today, we still have politics, we still have religion, but under the same roof, we very seldom have a rainbow of opinion or diversity, but under the same roof, we basically have either now what we would consider to be a red church or a blue church that kind of matches the red state or the blue state or the red community or the blue community. So I don't know how that weighs into the conversation, except to say somewhere along the way, these moral foundations can also become nationalized and politicized. And I think that's what I'm hearing you gentlemen say today is it has become so politicized and so nationalized that it's become galvanized and crystallized. It's concreted.
Mm-hmm.
And it may stay in that sense of permanence for the foreseeable future in our lifetimes.
Well, the human being, I think, wants to have that crystallization, that concretized experience. I mean, Moses has been up on the mountains for a long, long time. You sure he's coming down? I don't know, but let me give me all your gold and I'll make something that we can look at and touch and say, this is going to be okay. Well, let me write all these things down, all these stories and all these rules. We started out, if you will, with one experience in the garden. Don't eat of this tree. Everything else is here. Don't eat of this tree. And from there, we've just gotten more and more and more. You started out, Todd, at the beginning when you said, it's all pretty well, codified under love God, your neighbor as yourself. But who's my neighbor? What is myself? What's the situation that it needs to be in that? We want, as human beings, the mind needs this either or. The
Mhm.
mind needs the the black or white world, this bilateral kind of
Mhm.
experience, so that it knows where to stand. And over and over again, scripture tells us and God tells us, I'm all you need, but I am not concrete. I will be what I will be. That's my
Mhm.
name.
Say that one more time.
I said scripture and God over and over again says there isn't anything concrete here except for me. And I'm going to be what I'm going to be, which for me puts me in that sense of working with the change. What is it? We can't get this authoritarianism because human nature and human will hungers for certainty. And Gerald May wrote a book called Will and Spirit. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, and everything. Fabulous book. But he says that within the human creature, that we will ultimately will always win out over spirit, where spirit is kind of like, okay, we're going to be here, we're going to be open, we're going to work with this, we're going to have this walk of faith and everything. Will take whatever kind of good stuff with that and corrupt it. That's his language. It will corrupt it so that it supports this sense of will and what it's doing right. And we as human beings hunger for that solidity, because I believe life is fragile, and we don't want to deal with the fact that life is fragile.
Mhm.
So I need something concrete, need something solid, and that is God and God's word. I've even heard some folks say and everything, God can't change this thing. This is what God said. Yes, it says Holy Bible on it. I have one close, even as the reprobate I am. You know, God can't change this. This is God's unchanging word and stuff. And it's like, no, it's not, and it can't be, because when it does, when this becomes concrete, it loses all life, and it loses all validity in my world, because God says, "You will have no other God before me," including this, including my own will, including whatever it is that I put my authority and my trust in. I am who I will be, who I will be.
And I think that goes to one of the names of God that people don't like to use, but is so crucial, is God is mystery. And you have to say, I'm going to devote myself to a God that I know some. I know God is love. I know God
Mm-hmm.
is life giver. Um, but there's a lot of stuff that I don't know, and that I'm going to discover along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And there are going to be things that I think I know about God that are going to be changed at another point. And so it in inherently being devoted to God is a humility, because God is never completely knowable. He is who he is. She is who she is. And you work with that, and you stay frustrated with that, and you stay
Mm-hmm.
vulnerable to that. And that requires a whole different uh, experience than saying, holding up something tangible and saying, this is it, I've got a handle on God and truth. And it's too easy, it becomes weaponized. Whereas when you keep God in
Mm-hmm.
the mystery sense, you have nothing to hold on to turn into a weapon. You have to stay open and keep your hands in a posture of welcome and giving, rather than
And reception.
harming. Right. That's right. So Shane, what's your final reflection after our conversation today?
My wrap up response would be this: I do think that we walk a very thin and fine line of danger in trying to uh, prioritize or value one moral foundation over the other, or quantify. one moral foundation over the other. If in fact these moral foundations are true, I think they're all equal in weight, in substance, and in priority. The question becomes, how do we define them? How do we define them, and how do we work them out? How do we make them applicable as we implement them into our lives? I think that's what I'm going to sit with after this conversation.
Galen, how about you? What's your takeaway today?
Yeah, I think to follow up with that, I may rumble around and spend some time with the word foundations, because when you start talking about foundations like this, that these are the things that are there, then they become concretized. These become the important things. And honestly, for me as a person of faith, first and foremost, I mean, that's who I've tried to define myself for many, many years, as a person of faith, first and foremost. What does that mean, and how within the midst of those, I guess, do you find where is the mystery of God? Use the word mystery, Todd, and it is a deeply meaningful word for me. It is where I find my spiritual basis, is the unknowable mystery that is God, which requires me to continue to be evermore seeking what God is saying, sending me back to my knees, back to silence, whatever it is, however I seek those, that direction. So I'm curious about the word foundations with that. What becomes foundational for us?
I think for me, the power and the danger of language and story and how they communicate morality. How can I use language and story to bring everybody along to some degree, at least knowing that you'll always alienate some people. There's just no way not to, but thinking about how, as much as possible, using those tools effectively to draw everybody along on the moral and understand about thinking about their morality, and reacquainting with the mystery, and renewing their commitment to humility before the mystery of God.